This is the Sunday stream opening song because the other song is copyrighted. La 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 la. Oh look, here comes Dog Cat Fox.
Hi, Sky.
Good morning, everyone. Sunday morning. This is the Sunday stream, the stream I do on Sundays because Sunday is the day to stream on Sundays. Hope you're all doing well this morning. Hope you've had a good weekend so far. Oh, I'm stretchy. And I am ready to delve back into the wonderful world of the intelligence community and its employment, I suppose, of DEI initiatives, as you can see on the screen there. Yes, this is part 2, likely the last part, because I don't know how much more of this I can take, of this look at what the, I guess, professionals and veterans of the intelligence community, the American intelligence community, have to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion in their industry. In the first part, we heard some kind of mixed message kind of things, because there is a completely rational argument to be made that in the intelligence community, which deals with information and understanding things, having people around and involved who have a knowledge and understanding of many things in the world is obviously very useful and beneficial. And depending on the situation, if we're talking about field operations and such things, or embedded agents and so on, there is an argument to be made, a very easy argument, that aesthetics often do matter in that regard. But when you're talking about the back office kind of thing, when you're talking about just the analysis, the people behind the scenes and so on, and you start talking about identity politics, that's where you start to lose me. And that's where a couple of our speakers started treading their toes into in talking about being able to see yourself here or there otherwise, or how everybody at the top looks the same, and that's a problem. And as always, I ask the question, well, if that is the identified problem, how do you propose to solve for that? Maybe we'll get an answer to that now. Maybe we won't. But we're starting halfway through the half of the entire presentation that I decided to clip. Like I say, I'm not going to probably do a part 3 on this unless there is some really compelling reason to do so. Anyway, before we get into all of that, who is joining me on this beautiful Sunday morning? Jaeger Pony, Seftus Wolf, Mike R., JMK, Brett Ide, some Namgyal Nation, Texas Attorney General Secret Agent, Keever Dam, and let me make sure to put those GoFundMes at the top of the chat box if you guys can take a look at those for Shady Grin and Angry Illinoisian and his kitten. They and their loved ones could certainly use some help if you have an opportunity to do so. Nothing to see here. Burgit, Jamie Melquist, Ryan R., if I didn't already say Ryan R. There's a Mike R., there's a Ryan R. I'm sure they're brothers or something. Simon Willikins, Brittany Holland, a Tall Person, and anybody else I've missed? A Scanner Daftly, and then chat jump because, of course, it is Rotten Corpse, Mike Savage, Blarg, and Johnny Hellcat. And good morning to you all. If I missed anybody, I apologize. Chicago Mike, there you are, Chicago Mike. See, I don't see your avatar. It's like I'm blind to it now that you've changed your avatar. Anyway, all that is preamble. Let's get right into it. As usual, I will go for an hour and a half in real time at most, unless there is something compelling me to go further. And we'll find out more now about the brief history of intelligence community DEI initiatives. I'll start off with a couple of seconds for sound test. You guys tell me if you can hear it, and then we will go forward.
So I'd like to turn the floor over now to Lindsay, who's going to walk us through sort of a brief history of ICDEI initiatives. Okay,
you guys hear that all right? Let me know. And Mike R. says, LOL, no, we are not relations, Skyblight. Yes. Well, Private Gump, I believe you. Does that make me Lieutenant Dan? Does that mean I'm going to lose my legs at some point? I hope not. Sounds fine, says some Amdel Nation. Loud and clear, good buddy, says Texas Attorney General Secret Agent. All right, so let's learn some history of the DEI initiative. So, DEI initiatives that have already taken place in the intelligence community. But of course, despite these things, apparently, we still have a lot of work to do, and nothing's perfect.
we found in our research.
Okay.
I think it's worth noting it's not necessarily everything that has ever been done, but certainly publicly known and we've been made aware of.
Okay.
In the past 70 plus years. So
70 years. You see, I have to assume then that you took certain things that weren't, considered under the same terms as DEI and brought them under the category of DEI retrospectively, correct?
Lindsay, over to you, and you let me know when you want me to move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And first and foremost, I just want to say that it's important to recognize that the IC has really been on the same diversity journey as much of American society. And so what we really sought in this project was to find what was unique about the IC and what were the areas that maybe we could improve upon in general. Next slide, please.
Okay. Why aren't you in control of your own slides? Seems kind of inefficient, but okay.
So the first era that we kind of broke down to look at this was really from the inception of the CIA until the late 1980s.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the Cold War era, we noticed that, the CIA historically recruited from a very narrow group of people. It was very elite. And we saw mostly a recruitment from the Ivy Leagues and Wall Street, promoting kind of a very homogenous community. Mm-hmm. This generally excluded women and minorities. Mm-hmm. And though there were women at the agency. So the first report that we found of significance was in 1953, which was actually directed by then Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles. And it was called the Petticoat Panel. And I will say the one really interesting thing about this report is that it actually remains classified today. And you'll hear this kind of throughout as this idea of transparency and the challenge specifically for the IC of balancing security and transparency when dealing with this diversity challenge, specifically with personnel demographics. So it was in 2013 that the CIA released a report that detailed much of this original report. Okay. It provided a lot of insight into what happened at this time.
Okay.
Next slide.
In 1953. Okay, so 11 years before the Civil Rights Act and equal employment and things like that. Yeah, okay. All right.
Please. It's also important to recognize that this was the first example of internal pressure from within. The report was actually commissioned because senior women at the organization lobbied for this to be done, and were actually the members on the panel.
Okay, so senior women at the CIA wanted there to be more consideration for women. Okay.
But ultimately, once the panel was presented to the board of all men, actually, little really was done at this time to implement the suggestions.
Back in 1953. Well, I can believe it.
It was not seen as a mission imperative.
Uh-huh.
Diversity was seen as a challenge, but it was really more seen as this was a potential discrimination act towards women, and the director wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Okay.
We really saw like a lack of buy-in from mid and senior level managers, but really at this time, it's also important to recognize kind of the period of where we were in history. As I say, this was really symbolic of kind of the thinking of where we were going in the 50s and 60s.
Yes. Okay. So around this time when actual laws of equality and fair treatment were thankfully coming to the fore, so were such thinkings in the internalized management of the CIA. Okay, perfectly fine, good. Things were evolving. Yes, that's good.
So it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s when EEO legislation came out requiring changes to be made.
Yes.
And there was an interesting commentary in the mid 1970s where there was recognition of and actually implementation of some of the previous recommendations. And again, this recognition that diversity may be important, but there was really no traction in pushing this forward as a mission imperative.
See, I know I'm probably for some splitting semantic hairs here, but why are you including efforts of equality under the rubric of diversity, equity, and inclusion when those three things rarely have anything to do with equality of opportunity? I guess that's one of the issues is that sort of like when you read so many news stories about immigration and the news outlets, as I've read for the last 4+ years, specifically CNN and Washington Post and so on, tend to ignore the distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration and just call immigration and immigrants as some kind of, monolithic collective. Equal opportunity legislation and what is the current movement of DEI are two completely separate things. And yet they're being concatenated together as though they are one giant philosophy, when they're not. They have completely different goals in mind. So that's why all of this is perfectly fine, right? In my mind, this is at that time, laws were being changed and society was evolving, thankfully, in America, to a more equality-minded philosophy on employment and education and so on, and opportunities in general. When do we get to the line of now we're going to consider things that have nothing to do with looking past non-determinative factors of merit and then valuing non-determinative factors of merit? That's the dividing line.
Next slide, please. So the next era that we looked at was really from the late 1980s to 9/11. Mm-hmm. And this started out when it was actually the first and I believe the only African-American chair of any intelligence committee, which was Congressman Louis Stokes, started to bring up this idea of diversity as an operational necessity.
Okay, and by what utility? This is the thing. Diversity of what? And what is the utility in that diversity? Especially when you're talking about demographics.
And so this came up now in Congress for the first time in the late 1980s. Simultaneously, there were several big moving kind of situations, reports, and things going on. We also started to see the media get involved. So there was a CIA, class action lawsuit against women, against the agency for discrimination. And there was also a significant media presence against, now we see the NSA talking about minorities, the lack of minority hiring in NSA. During this time, there was a report produced by the CIA that was briefed to Congress, and basically resulted in the fact that, look, we identified that there are glass ceilings for women and minorities and different people of different ethnic groups, that women were concentrated and minorities were concentrated at lower grades, promotion rates were a challenge.
Okay, yes. Removing things that actively discriminate against someone for possessing some attribute, racial, gender, otherwise, yes, removing those things is good. Installing philosophies that then value those things as what is to be considered first as filtration for hiring or promotion or otherwise, that's where things go the opposite direction. So, yes, removing barriers is good. Installing filters is a step backwards.
Next slide. So once the lawsuit was settled, the CIA lawsuit, the CIA was required to provide back pay and salary increases to some women, retroactive promotions, and transfers back to operational roles.
Okay.
There was now a significant leadership buy-in that they vowed to.
Okay, for some women. So I'm assuming, unless you say otherwise, they identified those individuals when compared to their other, male colleagues or otherwise, should have had a more equitable outcome based on similar performance, similar tenure, and so on, right? It's not for all women just because you're a woman, but because they identified those individuals who had effectively suffered from discrimination. I mean, until you tell me otherwise, I'm going to assume it was a person-by-person, case-by-case situation. It wasn't just you're a woman, here's a bunch of money. Correct?
Promote and support people fairly. And at the same time, we saw diversity hearings every year from 1993 to 1996 addressing this challenge. So now we started to see internal pressure and external pressure, both from Congress and from media at large.
Okay, what does a diversity hearing mean? And again, I know I'm asking these questions rhetorically. I'm not going to get direct answers, obviously, but if you're removing the active exclusion of people on the basis of non-determinative factors, good. Now, but again, the danger is then, are you in trying to, fix the problem or address past wrongdoings, you're going to be taking a step backwards and start selecting people on the basis of those same factors to try to balance the scales, because that's not the right way to go. So where are we going with this? Okay, so you're trying to deal with getting rid of glass ceilings. Okay, and then?
I'd also like to, talk about this last point here, which was that many retired CIA officers described this as a really significant turning point,
Sure.
as bringing this really to surface and provided some really provided some teeth to the issues that people were bringing up internally.
Okay.
And next slide, please. And lastly, we see 9/11 to the present day, and this was a significant turning point.
You're not saying, you don't say.
Now we knew that diversity was mission imperative, as you saw previously when Michael was talking.
Why? Okay, what did 9/11? Okay. Again, diversity of knowledge, thought, and skill. So yeah, people who knew the cultures, languages, and so on of the new enemy after 9/11. Okay, that kind of diversity makes perfect sense, because the abilities and merits possessed by an individual that are helpful towards solving a problem and gathering intelligence makes sense. That is wholly different than simply hiring someone because they have a particular set of genitals rather than a particular set of skills. Unless the genitals are, I don't know. What are we talking about again?
That there was policy and directive after the other addressing, diversity is now a mission imperative. We need diversity for mission necessity. This is really important. But
okay, stop. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pause game here, but it's this. For lack of a better word, collectivizing the word diversity and not defining it. Okay, that could mean so many things right now, and our speakers so far have either referenced or intimated to various ways you can consider diversity. In the intelligence community, specifically, and probably most importantly, I would consider it to be diversity of thought, diversity of skill, diversity of experience in those areas of the world where we need to know what's going on and be able to interpret what's happening. But yet they keep, like I said before, calling everybody an immigrant and not acknowledging that there are different factors as to what constitutes someone having come to the country, legally or illegally. It's very frustrating when they're retreating to these omnibus words for a whole bunch of different things they could be referring to.
What we also saw was significant hiring, and we saw this increase in personnel to fight the global war on terror, as well as wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes.
There was also significant kind of changes to the IC in that there were deployments and kind of more of this militarized culture, significant hiring of contractors. And specifically what we learned from interviews was this actually played a significant, was a really significant cost for women specifically.
Yes, asteroid hurtles towards Earth, women most affected.
Who were in the position that if you wanted to promote, you had to deploy, and therefore it was a strain on people with families in general.
Men have families too, not just women. Why? Yes, if you want to have the same opportunities as someone else who is doing more than you do, you're going to have to at least attempt to match what other people are doing to gain more opportunities. I really hope that what I just heard was basically a flub or something in implying that women have families, but men don't.
This was also when Congress started to take a look again at what was going on in the 90s and what kind of legislation needed to be passed.
9/11 was not the 90s anymore, but okay.
Next slide, please. So now we saw, again, increasing pressure from Congress. We saw legislation passed that required the IC to report demographic information on diversity in the IC.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, this was required in 2005, and these reports were not published publicly until 2017, excuse me. So there was a long gap here of kind of the transparency of what was going on internally.
Well, I mean, if there's one area of the world where I would expect there to be lack of transparency on a lot of things, it would be the intelligence community, but okay.
We also saw in 2003 that it was reported still that women and minorities were still significantly represented in a lower percentage than both the civilian labor force and the rest of the federal government. So they're underrepresented most specifically in senior grades and core mission areas.
What do you mean by underrepresented? I mean, as compared to the population demographics of the country, and then we're edging into the God of the gaps theory of statistical analysis, right? There is a disparity, therefore there must be an inequity. The implication being that there was active discrimination taking place. Now, maybe there was. I don't know. But again, just to say that there is a disparity between these two things, therefore what's in the middle must be something insidious, always makes me a little edgy on believing somebody when they just kind of throw these things out there and not give any further context.
This actually was something that we saw again in 2015, and specifically then Director Brennan, who commissioned a study, they found in this study that this was the same challenge that they saw. And in many aspects, they said there was almost a reversal from 20 years past, specifically on the promotion and retention rates of diversity in the senior ranks.
Again, what did you find to be the causes of this? Okay, I will not, for the sake of argument, I will stipulate that, again, there were internal disparities when comparing the workforce by demographic spread. I can believe that. What do you see, or what did you find to be the causes? Just reporting numbers to us is one thing. Did you do any investigation into what might be driving those results?
And I'm actually, can you go to the next slide, please?
Okay.
Many of our panelists have kind of experienced these reports. And I'll be honest, there were report after report after report from 2011 to present. And there's been so many changes and so much stress on this being a mission imperative that it's actually it's hard to keep up with. But we do.
Well, I would hope that since this was your focus that you kept up with it, right?
We did find that over and over again, we seem to see the same trend and commentary that there is significant leadership buy-in. And then there is this challenge with culture change. There's a challenge with transparency and accountability and mid and senior level buy-in to implementing this change.
Okay, well, again, if you're talking about discriminatory and unregulated hiring practices of the 1950s prior to civil rights, I can believe it. Okay, but now that we're into the 2000s, what specifically was either being implemented, what policies were in place, etc., that were causing this? Right? I mean, I assume you have identified the causes of these results. Because if you keep seeing the same trends over and over and over again, despite how many changes are being made to policy, maybe it's not the policy. But then I don't know what you're talking about because you're not giving us any details.
And then I'll say one really interesting report that came out most recently was by GAO, and this looked at kind of how the community was implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives. Okay. And they still identified that there was really additional oversight needed and accountability needed in this specific area.
To address what issue? I mean, with as much bureaucracy and analysis and smart people that work in the intelligence community, as the name might imply, you identified what policies, practices, or procedures were resulting in these bad results, right? Or, again, in spite of all of the changes, the trends continued. So was it the policies that were leading to these outcomes, or was there something else at play? You're not telling us.
I think that's the next one, please. One additional area that we recognized throughout our research, and this really stems again really from 9/11 to present, was the fact that contractors are not counted for in diversity reporting and diversity reporting metrics.
Well, I mean, that's often the case in business in general. You know, you hire somebody for like 2 weeks to do XYZ. They're probably not considered a full-time employee, therefore, et cetera. And if you're talking about like military contractors, yeah, there was certainly a trend of not counting or moderating or overseeing military contractors from 9/11 forward for quite a while. Oh, Blackwater. Does anybody talk about Blackwater anymore?
And this is not surprising because it's not required by law,
right.
Frankly.
That's
But we do know that the amount of contractors that have been hired and that work, hand in hand with other people in the intelligence community was originally 27% in 2007, and potentially even up to 50%, we believe, at some times.
Yeah, and I've always had the suspicion, and if I'm wrong on this, by all means, correct me. I've always had the suspicion that let's see, nationally speaking, leaning on outside contractors for military operations and everything else was done to try to supplement our standing forces and try to avoid either the fear or the possibility of there being implemented a draft again. That was always my thought, is that besides the fact that you could sort of have plausible deniability and enough bureaucracy between the government and outside contractors for whatever the outside contractors might end up doing in the name of America, that there was also a desire to avoid the, let's say, PR nightmare that would become the case if the government decided to have to move towards a draft to make up for what it lacked in standing forces during the global war on terror. But maybe that's just me.
So now that number is falling, but we think this is a huge kind of gap in terms of recent reporting and metrics, because this is a huge part of the community that has not been previously accounted for.
Well, they're not required to be accounted for by law. So if they weren't accounted for and you don't have information, what does that have to do with anything? What?
Next slide. So we believe that nobody is really looking at these numbers because it's not required, but we do think that it is incredibly important and relevant when looking at the culture and the community that exists in the IC.
Okay.
As I previously said, another reports and people that we spoke with believe that this is considered in the reporting.
Okay, so you don't know. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. So there's a whole segment of the intelligence community that is not counted for, so you can't tell what it has to do. Okay. And okay, what would, if you knew that information, what would that tell you about the internal intelligence community policies, procedures, and so on? I mean, would you find out, like, I don't know, if the contractors are all a particular gender, would you then say that all the contractors or the people in charge of contracting were sexist? Or what do you, I guess, what would that information tell you more so about the policies and procedures of the internal workings of the CIA/intelligence community proper, right? Not the contractors, not the vendors, not the outside parties, but the actual accountable governmental employees and their policies. What would that tell you?
Next slide. All right.
Okay.
And back to you, Michael.
Okay.
Lindsay, thank you so much. Clearly, there's a lot we can learn from past efforts, and that's something we've tried to do here.
I mean, you've given us a bunch of statistics and some very hazy notions of accountability, culture changes, and so on. At the same time, you've told us that trends remain either as they were or quote unquote worse, although I don't know if that's, again, until you identify a cause that is something either insidious or illegal, I don't know what to make of these disparities.
Common challenges and trend lines across all different eras of history. And I want to just take a minute and highlight a few common themes before we turn to our panel to hear from their experience and observations in this space. So one big theme that we've seen, certainly since the Petticoat Panel of 1953, is that the community has struggled with insufficient transparency and metrics on matters of diversity and inclusion. Admittedly, this is a hard space to do if you think about the history and the nature of intelligence work. There's been challenges with accountability in both public sector employees, but also contractors doing the work of the American people. Transforming diversity policy into action has been consistently inconsistent. And we see a lot of structural challenges in bureaucracy as part of the reason. So differences between administrations, policy priorities, changing security environments. There's been moments of success, to be sure, but often, perhaps too often, it's been disregarded in favor of metrics that reinforce the status quo.
Okay, what's a success story? Give me something to compare and contrast here. As I'm always asking in so many of these presentations, I need an active example. I need something that was bad, and then something that was done, and an outcome that was positive. Just speaking about transparency, covering everything up in abstract notions and amorphous concepts doesn't help your argument when you're trying to inform us about something. I don't know if you realize that.
Contradictory policymaker direction and oversight has led to a lack of accountability. And this is something that we heard from D&I Haynes last year, and it's a theme and something that we've heard in report after report after report, as Lindsay talked about, both from Congress, but also from the IC itself, and often outside think tanks or universities. Okay, well, then with all of this information that you currently have, who has not been held accountable, and what should they be held accountable for? Right? I mean, you must have some information. Okay, there was a lack of accountability. All right, usually that means you see that someone did something wrong and they never had to answer for it. Okay, so can you give us, and I know I'm asking rhetorically again, can you give us an example of an administration or an official or whatever, or a policy that did a bad thing but never had to answer for it? Just so I have some idea of what we're talking about. Differences between the branches of government, broken relationships between the White House and the community. All of this plays a role, to be sure. Why was there a broken relationship between the White House and the community? And was it because, I don't know, George W. Bush decided to toss aside an intelligence briefing that might have alerted him that something was coming, or perhaps it was other intelligence failures in the course of the lead up to 9/11 and in the years afterwards. I don't know. So I'd like now to take another few minutes here to go around the table and just to hear from the experience and observations of our panelists on not necessarily exactly what we talked about, but any other observations and thoughts they have on these issues. And we'll start with... Wait. You're going to go around the panel to discuss not necessarily what you just talked about? Well, then why are we here? Natalie.
Always have to find my unmute button. All right. So in kind of thinking ahead towards this panel, I was trying to think about this question of sort of my experience and how it evolved over time with diversity, equity, inclusion, both as a cultural experience, but then also my role in shaping that as I kind of evolved in my career. Okay. So I have just a couple of thoughts, and I'll try to share some examples. So the first kind of takeaway that I had is, which I think is probably true for many people, is that my awareness and contribution to making the culture at the agency more inclusive evolved, right? So as a junior officer, you're not engaging in a lot of those activities as much, or you don't know what's out there, what's going on. And over time, you get a better sense of how your colleagues are interacting with this work, and then you're also volunteering and helping.
What are you talking about? Please, you said you're going to give us examples. I await with bated breath something specific.
And I think the main takeaway from that is actually there is a lot you can do right away. And I think my understanding of that evolved as I became a manager, and especially as the conversation shifted in my time between 2008 and 2021 in terms of the emphasis on this work and how everyone at every level could really contribute. So that
What work? This work. What?
I think evolved in my time there. And so
you've said the same thing 3 times now. What are you talking? I mean, maybe it's sort of like muscle reflex in the intelligence community to not say exactly what you mean. But then I thought that's what this panel was for, to be informative.
I'll give you kind of like an anecdotal kind of example of.
I'll take anything at this point.
How my own personal perspective changed.
Sure.
So, one of these studies that was mentioned was a study on women in leadership. I think it kicked off in 2013. So I was sort of a mid-level analyst at that time, and they ran a series of focus groups with different grade levels, and I participated in one of those focus groups. And it involved including like advisory board of external experts who were part of that review. And one of those people happened to be Madeleine Albright at the time, and she was part of this panel, and I was participating in this group. And the question I got was, how important is it to you as a junior female analyst to see women in some of these leadership roles?
Well, given your previous statements, I'm assuming, and I could be proven wrong in the next 10 seconds, I'm assuming very important.
And so, of course, on the surface at that time, the answer is yes, it's really important, and I appreciate and value all of the effort and what it took, right, in the decades that preceded my time at the agency for these women to reach those levels.
Yes. Okay. In that context, yes, it would be very impressive. And yes, given previous roadblocks and discriminatory practices and so on, those that have survived and thrived, yes. Okay.
Understanding that history,
because those individuals made it through at that time, right? It's about their individual effort, tenacity, dedication, etc. It's not about just because they were women, right?
But at the same time, for me, what was more important was the leader's quality and their traits. And so
yes! Thank goodness somebody said it. Okay. You had me worried earlier because you're talking about I can't see myself in the. So, well, okay, I should say you've given me mixed signals, let's say. Mixed signals so far. But that one, yes, very good.
For me personally, it was less important that they were women per se, and more important just who was inspiring as a leader.
Yes! Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Okay, so then, what are we talking about again?
And I gave that answer to them.
Okay.
And I think this is relevant because if you fast forward then to, 2020?
Oh, please don't tell me that your opinion changed. Oh, please don't tell me that when you talk about evolution, you decided to take a step backwards in your thinking. Please don't.
When Gina Haspel is appointed as the first female director of, earlier when the Trump administration came in, she's appointed as the first female director. The anecdote I have for that is I was walking down the hall in the main building of the agency. If you've ever been there, there's a wall of portraits. So every time there's a new director, they paint a portrait and they're there historically in chronological order.
Yes.
Of course, they are all white men.
And your previous philosophy on the personal merits and traits of the individual and not necessarily their aesthetic or biological qualities didn't kick in at that point either. Okay.
In a line going back decades.
Yeah.
You pass this every day, you go get your lunch. It's something just kind of in the background periphery.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, there was one day after she was appointed that it suddenly occurred to me as I was walking past this wall that someday there is going to be a portrait of her. And the reality was, going back to my initial experience, for me personally, directors like Brennan and Panetta had more of an engaging role in my experience. I had more engagement with them than I ever had with Gina Haspel. So as a director, I felt more connected to some of these male directors than I did to her.
Yeah, it's almost like it's about the character of the individual and has very little to do with non-determinative factors of merit.
But
okay, but
the fact that there was a woman in that position, it hit me at that moment how important it was for me personally that was possible.
You were doing so well,
and that it had happened, and that meant something to other people, including myself.
Okay, so even though in your personal experience, your engagement with your male superiors previously was far more, as you describe it, direct and, I don't know, enriching than when Haspel took over, the important part was that she was a woman. Not her engagement with you, not your experience with her directly, but just that she had the right aesthetic was more important to you at that moment. But, again, mixed signals. Good points, and then 3 steps backwards.
And I think what else that sort of, I guess, illuminated in a personal way for me, I reflected back on a related but separate experience that I had. So this was kind of a female gender identity example.
What, in the previous example wasn't? Oh, okay. Well, what's this one?
But throughout my career working at different levels, whenever I would have colleagues who were Black, the reality is there are fewer, as we said, the minority representation is fewer. And so the
minority representation is fewer. I can believe it, because, yeah.
Often, if you had a minority colleague, they were like the only person on the team, right? There was 1, maybe 2. And that was also reflected at senior levels, as has been discussed, right? I mean, I can count on 2 hands, going through this time, how many senior leaders who were Black were at the agency.
You count on 2 hands. So like, I don't know, what would you call that? A quota? Okay, well, like your colleague previously, I can't wait to hear if you ever say how you would solve for that particular problem.
Compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
And I remember talking with some colleagues who were my level, so junior level, and both of whom are Black, and they said, it's tough. I don't see other people who can share my experience. I don't feel like there's a pathway where people have my experiences that I can see, that I can relate to. And this was exactly kind of what I was saying, right? Like on the female study, I want to see people who I can relate to, but also who inspire me.
And you can only relate to somebody if they look like you. But you had good relations, professional relations, I should say, with your previous male superiors, but not so much with your female superior. But the fact that she was female sort of overrode all that. And now we're back to aesthetics again. Okay. Well, should people be promoted to senior management on the basis of their race then? Because, again, as so many times previous, I'm not quite sure how else to solve for this problem of yours without implementing discriminatory hiring and promotional practices. So what are you asking for?
And it was, again, at this moment when I saw this, when I had this recognition that there would be this female portrait, I could at least relate to some of what my colleagues might have experiencing before, which is they need to be able to see examples of success that resonate with them. It's important for them to understand how a pathway could look for themselves, and that this agency values their experience and their contribution.
No. You are not asking for a valuation of experience and contribution. You are asking for a valuation of gender or skin color in these 2 instances. That is what you're asking for. What does success, quote unquote, look like? You are advocating for skin color to be a mark towards someone's success. Something that they did not earn, they did not work for, says nothing about their character. You want to have someone put into a place of authority as a poster child to satisfy the racial and or gender, I don't know, necessities of someone else's need to feel good about themselves? Is that really what you are effectively recommending have happen in the intelligence community to improve the intelligence community? And do you understand how that is a giant leap backwards in civil rights?
And they could see a way to stay here. Because at the time when I was interacting with colleagues...
Well, how are you there? How were you there for so many years through two directors, it sounds like, right? You were there for, I don't know, decades or something. I forget exactly what your history was. But there wasn't a female director in your time up until that point. How did you stay? How could you have possibly thought that you could have a career in this when there wasn't a female director? And there were so few women at the top. How are you sitting here now? How is that possible?
That was a reason for them not to stay, right? They were thinking and looking around and saying, is this really the right place for me?
Okay, so you had colleagues who decided to leave because there weren't enough people around who looked like them. Imagine if a white person came into a situation and made that same statement. But what would you say about that person? If they came into a situation where there was predominantly non-white people around and that person said, this place is obviously not for me, and they just walk out. What would you think about that person?
And so I think that kind of highlighted for me, again, this importance on diversity as not just a mission imperative, which it is.
You keep telling me that it is, but you're not telling me what the utility is in it, other than inspiration. It's like gender and skin color are morale boosts. That's all that you've classified these things as. You've offered nothing, and I'm not just talking about our speaker right here, but in general, the panel thus far. Aside from morale boosts, I haven't heard anything of a utilitarian argument for gender, race, orientation, whatever. I mean, until you start talking about field operations and how specific assets need to be X, Y, Z in order to fit in with this community in order to gather intelligence, that one I could believe. I could believe that. But what you're talking about right now, you're talking about making people feel good about themselves based on their gender or race in this case. All right.
But this idea that you need to reflect the community you're from is important because people need to feel like they can have a way forward and a career path that is viable, that seems real.
Well, how are you there? How are you still? How did you have a career at all? How was it possible? You didn't see anybody that looked like you. You didn't have enough female representation in management to make you feel inspired, yet still here you are. How is that possible?
So that's kind of one anecdote. In terms of other things that I noticed that changed over my time, a lot of what was reflected in this study demonstrates that kind of post even the 2006, 2007 timeframe, which is right around the time when I entered the agency.
2006, 2007, okay.
There were a lot more momentum in studies and comments and commitments from senior leadership on the importance of diversity. And I think that was borne out for me too, in terms of the shifting environment and the creation of more space to talk about these issues, even just in the last 2 years. So like everywhere else in America, the murder of George Floyd and the protests that erupted after that. Were galvanizing, at least from my perspective.
I can imagine.
In terms of both top-down and bottom-up demand for conversation around this and what it meant for our community and how we could be more diverse.
Okay. How does the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a local police officer have anything to do with the intelligence community writ large? What effect did any of that have? Maybe there was. I don't know. But I'm maybe it's the poverty of my imagination. What did that have to do? What did that have to say about what was going on in the intelligence community?
Not just be more diverse, but to talk about these issues and be more inclusive.
What issues? What issues? Specifics, examples, details, please.
And that, I think, was a huge moment that really shifted, as it did kind of across the country, in terms of bringing more space to talk about these issues and more ideas, more people being interested in doing this work.
What work? This work? What are you talking about? What issues? What specific policies, procedures, structure? What is going on in the intelligence community that is actively contributing to discrimination? Tell me what those things are and how they either are not being addressed. There has to be something specific taking place, right? Or there has to be individuals in charge of things who have been discovered, at least through action, words, habit, other things, memos, to be themselves in control of a discriminatory process. With all this research, with all this documentation, with all this study, you should be able to identify specific things, policies, people, whatever, that are causing identifiable problems that can be resolved. These issues, this work, what are you talking about?
Within the agency. And I think just the last point I'll make is, so again, my takeaway is that I felt like there was positive momentum.
Such as? Give me, I know I'm a broken record. I don't mean to be, but good gravy. My reflexive question is, can you give me an example? What is a success story? Give me a success story so I can at least imagine a contrasting failure state.
At least at the point at which I was leaving. But, there is still this split between people who perceive, that are we trying to get to diversity for diversity's sake? Or is it this mission imperative? I think
What's the difference between those two statements? Mission imperative. Diversity for diversity's sake. Why is it a mission imperative? How does it contribute to, quote unquote, the mission, as opposed to doing it just for the sake of the ideological feel-good nature of it? I have yet to hear, outside of a morale boost, what the utility is in this effort. I haven't heard any examples of what the effort looks like. And conflating equality of opportunity and the laws thereof and the evolution of that philosophy from the 50s on through to now is not the same as DEI.
There is still a bit of that dynamic, but again, I think progress is being made, and although it's not necessarily ubiquitous mindset yet, I do think there's been a lot of shift at the senior levels at that. And I had that experience working in my last role for senior leaders who really valued the need for this conversation and action steps that they wanted to take. To promote what they could change within their department, within their center. And so that, I think, was a very positive kind of outcome of creating more space and more people being willing and interested in being part of this work.
Unless they didn't see enough people around them that looked like them, and then they quit, I guess. So would you say that the people that gave up were, detrimental to the process? Or I don't even know what we're talking about.
Well, thank you, Natalie. That's just such a powerful story. That was a powerful story. Really, was it? It was powerfully frustrating and confusing, I suppose, if you're not going to qualify it otherwise. Thinking about the portraits, that is not something that I had considered or really thought about, but
Yeah, the portraits. What are portraits? Nothing but aesthetics. They represent nothing but the image of a person. Imagine that. That is a great metaphor. That is an excellent metaphor for what our previous speaker here apparently valued after beforehand valuing someone's inherent skills and abilities outside of their gender, but then doing a complete 180 because of a portrait.
The effect and the impact of walking down the hallway and seeing that now after generations of change is remarkable.
Oh, it's true. You are able to remark on it. It's true.
Can I just add a comment on portraits real quick?
Oh, Jesus. Okay. The volume on this. Okay, I'm gonna let me ratchet that down a little bit.
Because
Please, yeah.
It's not just the wall of directors, but just about every conference room of a main office, you see all the previous directors, and yes, there's a lot of homogenous looking faces there, I would say. So that's only lately beginning to change. That's a real visible sign of the type of diversity or lack thereof that you see.
Yes, because as we know, every one of those individual portraits represents the same mindset, the same skills, the same experience, the same person. They're not individuals. No. They're all homogenous, easily dismissed as just all belonging to the same collective. The intelligence professionals amongst us, everyone.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Lori. Kristen, over to you. And I know I see a hand from a familiar face we'll go to in a minute, but go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, good. Thanks so much, Michael. So I want to focus a little bit on what's changed.
Thank goodness. Please give me something to compare and contrast, a starting state and the current state.
So having the perspective of about 30 years. And
Okay.
I think that's important because, I look at it from what's changed over all that time, where we need to go. And that's not to say, to Jeff's point, to me, and Lori's point, absolutely we should be there.
Where? What does there look like? And where are we at now? And where were we at before? Please.
And then I think about how far we've come over time.
Yes, there has been change. From what to what?
And I want to make sure to note those points too. So
please.
I think, first of all, when I started in the late 80s, there weren't very many women there at all.
I can believe it.
In the part of the organization I was in. In fact, so much so that I came in on a Monday and my mentor was mad at me first when I started. And I thought, well, okay, I haven't been here long enough to have done anything yet. So kind of what is happening? And he said, well, you guys are ruining things. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, you women. I said, well, I've been here for an hour and a half now, so I'm not really sure what you mean. And he said, well, this was a more, traditional military part of the organization. And they said, well, we had to take down all the posters of women that we had posted everywhere. And because they said you would object. And I just looked at him and he said, you wouldn't object, would you? And I said, yeah, actually, I kind of would have. So. Okay,
granted, you had a chauvinist, sexist boss. All right.
So, it's just that of a mindset of someone who at that time had been working for 20 years, and that was the way that it was.
Okay, all right. And so that was the 80s. And so now things have changed, right? That's no longer acceptable. That's not a standard. It's not a boys' club. It's not a frat house. Okay. I'd be kind of glad to know that there's more professionalism in the intelligence community after the fact, honestly.
And so, many more women there now across the organization. I don't know what the balance is, but pretty.
You don't know what the balance is. Oh, okay.
Even.
Pretty even. Okay. All right.
And I think about what has changed because I was recently involved in an event that featured Virginia Hall. So for those of you who don't know, she's an Office of Strategic Services, so the predecessor to CIA.
Yes.
Just a legend.
Okay.
She is the only woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions in World War II. So behind enemy lines in Europe, running networks,
Yes.
setting up operations.
So she's a legend for what she did.
To close off bridges and tunnels and to stop the German resupply to
Yes.
allow allies to invade. And what her work did, what it was remarkable. And when CIA was established, she went to the follow-on organization and was just this dynamite woman who had done everything overseas on a wooden leg. She was trying to escape the Germans because they were after her. Finally, she had to leave, and she crossed the Alps on wooden leg.
Okay.
In the winter.
Yeah, sounds like a story that's made for a cinematic epic film. I can believe it. There are a lot of crazy, practically superhero level stories of what some people did during World War II and onward, and even today. Okay.
I mean, just think about that, right? And so she comes to sit at headquarters.
Yes.
And they're not really sure what to do with her.
Okay.
And her first performance review is by a manager who's not her manager. And he says, well, I'm not really that impressed with her. She hasn't, done this, that, and the other, and she doesn't wear makeup. And
this was back how long ago again? At the birth of the CIA in the 1950s. Okay. Again, for the sake of argument and given the era and the thinking and the attitudes of the time, I will stipulate, I believe you for the sake of this. Not that it would matter otherwise. So presumably this is not how things are done today, correct?
Virginia Hall, being no shrinking violet, called the president of the United States of America, with whom she was very familiar, and said, I don't think this is fair. And he called the director of CIA and said, perhaps you would like someone to review her performance who actually saw it versus someone from a distance. And she got a better review. But I think it just was a sign of she was out of the box creating magic for our country. And all of a sudden, because she was a woman, she was expected to be in this little box.
Back in the 1950s, you say. Okay.
And I think about the Hidden Figures and the story that we've all read the book, right? There wasn't even a restroom that Black women could use in the same building.
Back in the 1950s, and I'm assuming 60s, you say. Yes, things were worse in the past. You're pushing in an open door. I'm wondering, as I have been this entire time, what DEI initiatives are doing today, how they work, what their goals are, etc. Civil rights, what we consider civil rights violations today for what you're describing back then, that's why the Civil Rights Act came into being. That's why laws often come into being, because we are acknowledging that we were doing things incorrectly before, and a new law is a confession to previous bad action and a promise, societally, legally, and otherwise, to do better going forward. Yes, there are lots of stories like this. And
then I think about the case officers, the very first case officers, Lori, 10 years, 15 years before we came in, there weren't any women. And they had to fight really, really hard to do that because they didn't think women could do the job.
Okay.
And the generation before us, really, they had to dress like women.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this banking suit with the big shoulders. I mean, everyone remembers the 80s. Well, maybe you don't, but I do. And these men look because you did not want to call attention to the fact you weren't a man. And so I think about how that has changed now.
Yes.
And I think a big part of it is more women as part of the organization. There's a much more diverse workforce, much more needed to be done.
Were all of these people hired because they were women? That's my only question. Are there more women in the workforce because they were hired for their genitalia, because of their gender? Or were they hired because of their skills, experience, dedication, loyalty, etc.? That's all I need to hear about this. But I'm getting signals from your other friends and speakers otherwise. So yes, since the 1950s, attitudes on gender equality and racial equality have changed. You got me.
Mid-career hires, though, are another element of diversity. People who had been in professions for 10, 15 years elsewhere who came to help.
Yeah.
And in fact, so much so, if you think about before 9/11, they created something called the Red Cell, which was a group of people who we were so concerned about groupthink and missing things. It was.
You're so concerned about groupthink? Did you just listen to your colleagues talking about how a whole wall of portraits of individual people is homogenous? I don't think you have expelled groupthink from your industry or your profession quite yet.
It's the group of original thinkers who sometimes had been a little ridiculed in their parts of the organization, were brought together to think creatively. And I think...
So bringing people together who all have different experiences, different expertise, and different areas of intelligence in order to exchange notes and try to improve the all-around perspective and informational library? I don't know. I'm running out of words here. Imagine that. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Diversity of knowledge, diversity of skill. You got me. That is the easiest sell in the world for the intelligence community. That's not what is being talked about, though.
That was a huge element of diversity as well. So,
yeah, diversity. Go back to the aesthetic part. How does the aesthetic part have anything to do with quote unquote diversity and contributing to the intelligence community?
The millennials also, I think, are bringing much to the mission as well.
Are they?
With their different perspective. And
okay, what is the different millennial perspective? Would you at all possibly quantify that for me? Because I don't know what that means.
I just know, one of the questions you asked before was, did it matter when we saw things differently? And I think of a couple things. When I was there in the early 90s, I created something called the NPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center Women's Development Group.
Whoa. National Photographic... Sorry, I'm going to back up a little bit.
When I was there in the early 90s, I created something called the NPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center Women's Development Group.
Okay, that first part I understood. What's the Women's Development Group?
Because we didn't really know how to be professionals and we didn't have a lot of help. And so we brought...
Well, what? You didn't know how to be professionals? You had gotten all the way... Again, I'm assuming... I forget exactly what her career path was. I'm assuming she was in the CIA, but whatever. You were in an intelligence arm of the United States government. You were already there, and you and your fellow female colleagues didn't know how to be professionals. What does that have to do with the photographic... What?
Brought in senior women to talk to us about, managing and taking risks, about how to succeed in interviews and all of these things like this.
Okay. So you're talking about professional development. Oh, okay. I guess. You don't know how to be professionals, don't know how to take a risk. I mean, okay, everybody needs encouragement. All right.
And in the course of the conversation, what I discovered was the experience of Black women, and at the time it wasn't women of color, it was white women and Black women. Yeah, because that was such a great leap forward. And that's obviously evolved and enriched as well since then.
Enriched. You guys are complaining about homogenizing, and yet you go from being at least somewhat distinctive to grouping everybody into one category and everybody else into a separate category. Groupthink, terms that I had thought went the way of the dodo with separate water fountains, are now in vogue and apparently enriched. Okay.
They were saying, if you think you have it bad, we have two barriers.
Is this intersectionality? Is this the progressive stack? Sounds like it to me.
Not only are we women, but we're women of color. And what they described their experience was in I had frustrations about, maybe not being considered physicians. They had to fight to be considered not to be secretaries, right? And so I think that gap between white men and women and people of color has maintained. All of us have done better, but I don't think the gap has changed much. And
Okay, how would you solve for that problem? What policies, procedures, etc. would you implement in your 30, 40 some odd years of experience to change that? I mean, you must have an idea, or you must have implemented something, right? What would you do to solve for this problem?
I think that's something we definitely have to fix.
Okay, I'm all ears. How would you fix it? If you had all the authority in the world and could do anything you wanted to do, what would you implement in order to fix this?
So, I'll stop there.
Honestly, I wish you wouldn't, because citing some amorphous problem and not then giving any idea with the leverage of your expertise as to what you would do to solve it is very frustrating.
Just to say, that's where we've come from. And the people in leadership now who've been there for 30 years, that's what they've witnessed. So not being as close to the cutting edge as folks on the outside are.
What?
I think that imperative that's driven by the Biden administration, by Director Haynes, by Director Burns, is going to be vital.
Wasn't the first director that was female, wasn't she appointed by Trump? The other lady just basically noted that as the grand sea change in her thinking. They're having only what Biden is doing has had an effect. You can't cite anything else from anyone else. Nothing occurred under Obama's administration when it came to intelligence. Like, why is okay? What is so revelatory about what Biden is doing? I honestly don't know. I'm not being facetious. I honestly don't know why they keep citing whatever Biden has instituted as being noteworthy, but no other previous president's actions in the last, they're going back at least 50, 70 years or something. What is Biden doing specifically? Or was that in the last episode and I just missed it or forgetting?
But that's a bit where they're coming from. And I'm really interested to hear Lori's perspective as one of the leaders of the directors advisory group led by Madeleine Albright, who we recently just lost. But that was done in April 2012, so 9 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it talked about a lot of the gaps between men and women at the time.
Uh-huh.
And Lori was one of the seminal figures in executing that. So I'd love to hear what she has to say as part of your dialogue. Lori, sorry to tee you up for something, but just thank you for the opportunity to talk about that.
Okay, let me check out something real quick. 5702. See, I only clipped the first hour of this 2-hour panel, and I'm afraid that I might cut off right in the middle of somebody's speech, so I don't want to. And apparently, at some point, James Clapper comes in. If you guys don't know who James Clapper is, but maybe is he the next guy? Maybe he is. Okay, I'll let it run its course for the next few minutes here. I'll let it run out. I don't anticipate doing a part 3, but if I do, I might not make it a Sunday stream. I might make it a midweek stream. We'll see.
But just thank you for the opportunity to talk about that.
Well, thank you, Kristen. That's just an incredible story.
An incredible story of what? Historical anecdotes? Okay.
especially on Virginia Hall.
Okay, well, yeah, no, the Virginia Hall's story is like one of those things that, you know, if they didn't they make a movie? I swear they made a movie about her, or they made a movie inspired by her, or something like that. Because I've heard that name before, and I have a vague image in my head of a movie poster. So if I'm wrong on that, okay, but I swear there was a movie based around part of her World War II life.
Just an incredible American history there.
Yeah, and has almost nothing to do with the current zeitgeist of DEI.
But I am, just before we go to our next two panelists, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here, and I see what's called a two-finger in the audience, and a familiar face and a good friend to the project.
A familiar face that will not show up on camera, by the way. Let's see, and in the chat real quick, Keeverdam informs me, A Call to Spy. Is that the name of it? Okay. Yeah, because I have this, like I said, in my mind, I've got all these different movie posters about historical, female spies in America doing things, and I swear that was one of them. Scanner Daphne says Peggy Carter. Well, I mean, Peggy Carter might have been, or at least the MCU version might have been inspired by Virginia Hall. I wouldn't be surprised by that either. Okay, so James Clapper's here. At least his name is, and I assume his voice.
Director Clapper, it's good to see you, sir.
One of those white men one of those homogenous white men. I wonder how he felt sitting there going like, yeah, I was just another one of those white guys on a wall.
I can hear you.
Thanks. Can you see me, hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
I don't think I can do anything about that. That's okay.
Yeah, Director of Intelligence doesn't know how to operate a webcam. All right.
I'm ugly anyway. Hey, this has been a great discussion.
Has it been?
One
Really?
of the best I've ever listened to.
This has been one of the best discussions you've ever listened to.
And I think that's a function of the quality of the panelists you have.
Okay, well, admittedly, I have never before sat in on a conversation between intelligence officials about this subject, so I don't have any reference point for it. So this is one of the best conversations that James Clapper has ever heard. Golly gee whiz. I've been watching too many of these things.
I'd just like to say one comment about this, having struggled with it, this challenge as an agency director twice for almost 9 years, and again as DNI for 6.5. And I became convinced, and this is not politically correct, but I'll say it to this group.
Uh-oh. It's not politically correct. Here we go, guys. Scandal approaching.
Became convinced that the only way to really make progress in righting the wrongs with adequate representation of women minorities is to disproportionately recruit. You have to bring in a larger number of those cohorts, women and minorities, at the entry level, in order to ensure that you can overcome the challenges posed by the attrition that occurs for reasons, sociological reasons, I believe, that are beyond the control of the intelligence community to fix all by itself.
Well, the golden crown of honesty goes to James Clapper. Racial and gender discrimination must take place at the very front end of the process in recruitment in order to change these numbers. In order to right the wrongs of the past, we have to implement discriminatory practices in recruitment, and I presume promotion as well, if that philosophy follows through. Yeah, you're right, James. That is not politically correct. That is decidedly anti-1964 politically incorrect. But hey, he's not wrong. because this is what is being done in business and elsewise all over the place. It is a strategy that is meant to circumvent a lot of the hiring practices, right? And I know this is going to sound conspiracy theory, and it goes back to a lot of the hive diversity stuff I looked at in the past. But if you advertise and or recruit jobs or for positions by targeting specific areas, locations, etc., where you are likely to find, as Mr. Clapper here described, those people within those demographics you wish to bolster the numbers of in your workforce, and someone else who does not belong to one of those demographics is never aware of the opportunity or has a less likelihood of being aware of the opportunity, then the people who eventually apply or are brought into the hiring pool, they have no ability to claim that they were discriminated against when it comes time to actually make a decision on hiring. Right? Because if you're never aware of the job, if you're never given the opportunity to apply for a position, and the demographics are targeted, then where does the legal entanglement come in? Right? There's no victim if you were never discarded as an option to your face. Right? Now, again, I'm not a civil rights attorney. I'm not an expert in civil rights law, and I'm certainly not an expert in HR or DEI hiring insofar beyond what I've been told by experts on these videos. But he's absolutely correct. That is the only way you're going to solve for this problem, is to hire using discriminatory practices. You know what? With that being his introduction, I'm going to have to do a part 3. If for no other reason to at least hear out the rest of James Clapper. Because if that is his introduction to this conversation, I am dying to know where he goes from here. So I'm going to leave that as a cliffhanger. Now, as far as when I'll do the part 3, it might be tomorrow, it might be Tuesday. Not sure yet. I got to save Wednesday for Moon Knight. I only want to do one stream a day if I can help it. I did break that rule a little bit in the past, but yeah, no, I want to know what he says next. I cannot wait to find out what he says next. Boy, I thought I was done with this, but now I'm invested. I'll give a couple minutes here to you guys if you have anything you want to add, and then we'll wrap it up for the time being and find out later what James recruit through discrimination Clapper has to say. Zizi Atawari, hiring people based on race or sex isn't progressive, it's regressive. Yeah. I mean, they went through the history lesson of talking about the Civil Rights Act and EEOC and equal employment opportunities. And James Clapper has just said, to hell with that. We need to throw that out the window in the intelligence community. Let's see. I'm scrolling up a bit. I know you guys have been very talkative, and I've been focused on the conversation, as it were. So let me get some things in here. Let's see. Somnambular Nation. What about gay women of color with disabilities? What about how do you redress all of these wrongs if it's a matter of intersectional thinking on oppression? No name. The solution is simple: discrimination and racism. Well, that's what James Clapper just basically admitted to. Or I should say, that's what James Clapper has admitted to thinking is the solution. I have no idea, and unless he says something later on, what policies or strategies he promoted when he was in charge. But that is his thinking now on this subject, on this conversation that he says is one of the best he's ever heard. I really don't have anything to compare it to. Bridget, to repost Scribelight. I just joined a kendo club. Everyone else there is a man, yet I feel more camaraderie with them than these diverse clubs where people look like me. Yeah, imagine that, having a shared interest, a shared passion. Right? What's the old Paula Abdul song, Opposites Attract? MC Cool Cat or whatever it was, MC Scat Cat. Opposites attract. Interests, right? Where things link up, but also there are things that you don't know. It's not. If it's all about aesthetics, it's all about and James Clapper just proved it. The only way to solve for this problem. Boy, I should clip that and just play that out there. That's amazing. That really is amazing. Who else is on here? Lexi Mads, political correctness does come from Stalinist Russia, so good to know they're keeping up with the commies. This is going to be politically incorrect, which means you're just speaking what you actually feel is true. It's just like, when you preamble something like that, just say, this is what I think. It just, yeah. Anyway. Ebony Williams, good morning. Did I miss something that Ebony said? Script Doctor was here, or is here. I don't know which. Hi, Script Doctor. Let's see. Who else? I hope Script Doctor caught that bit from James Clapper. That'd probably make a good story point somewhere in a movie. All of a sudden. Anybody else? I got a couple of minutes left here. Bridget. Even at the shared passion clubs, the people can be very nasty when they focus on identity. I may also be biased because the men at the kendo club look very handsome. Bridget, are you focusing on aesthetics? There are appropriate times for that. That's an appropriate time. Some nominations, MC Scat. Yeah, I know. Wasn't that the name of the character? Was it Scat Cat or was it Cool Cat? I thought it was Scat Cat. Script Doctor. Yeah, I was rather shocked to hear Clapper suggest that course of action. I was shocked at the candor. Because, after watching so many of these types of things in the past, it is a rare day when someone just, lets the scales drop, so to speak, opens up the curtains and says exactly what they mean. Because as I was complaining about so often prior to James Clapper showing up, was the amorphous, abstract comments or suggestions or ideas. James Clapper, credit to him, he got right to the point. And what I'm really, actually, beyond what James Clapper has to say next, I'm really curious to find out now what the other people on the panel might say in reaction to it. I wonder, and we'll find out in part 3, hopefully, whether James Clapper just opened the door to let all of the pretense fall away. That would be amazing. That would be something. Let's see. Ebony Williams, I was here on and off. Okay, well, good morning, Sunday morning to you, Ebony Williams. And good morning, Sunday morning to the rest of you. I'm going to wrap this up here. Thank you all for joining me for this unexpected middle chapter of what will no doubt be a trilogy or more. I mean, I didn't expect to have a part 3, but look out for part 3 soon, probably tomorrow. I'm going to try to do it tomorrow, Tuesday at the worst. Try to, spread out my streams over the course of the week because you don't want to cross the streams. Anyway, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me here Thursday. Actually, I should take it back. Wednesday morning at some point, I'll be doing a review of Moon Knight, episode 5. Can it get any worse? Probably. And then Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, I'll be doing another episode of TED Excellence, where I'll take another look at another off-brand TED Talk. And then, of course, next Sunday, be here again for the Sunday stream, where I'll look at something different. I promise next week it'll be something other than the intelligence community. But everyone, thank you for joining me. Moderators, thank you for keeping an eye on things. Even though everyone here is so well-behaved and so engaged, you have very little to do. Everybody who donated, thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity, either to myself or to anybody in the GoFundMe's pinned to the top of the chat box. Shady Grin, Angry Illinoisian, and his kitten. They and their families could really use your help if you are able to provide it. And everyone, I hope you all have a good rest of your Sunday. I hope you all are safe and well. If you are not well, please get well soon, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.